The rain was relentless that night, pouring down in heavy sheets that turned the streets into streams and washed the neon reflections into liquid colors. Michael Turner, a 37-year-old single father, fumbled with the keys as he locked the door of his small cafe on the corner. He was bone-tired, his muscles heavy after another endless day of brewing coffee, serving regulars, and wiping down counters that seemed to never stay clean. Slumped against his shoulder was his 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, bundled in a faded pink raincoat that had once belonged to her cousin. Her soft breathing was steady, her tiny fists relaxed, trusting her father's arms completely as he carried her out into the storm. Michael had only one thought on his mind: get Sophie home, warm and dry, before she stirred awake. But life had a way of placing obstacles where you least expected them, and that night, fate forced him to take a detour. Wanting to shave a few minutes off their route, he turned into a dimly lit alleyway that cut between two abandoned warehouses. At first, the alley seemed deserted, save for the shimmering puddles and the humming buzz of a flickering street lamp. Then Michael froze. Not far ahead, 3 men loomed around a figure in a tailored suit. The stranger's pale face caught the weak glow of the lamp, and Michael recognized him almost instantly: Ethan Cole, the 42-year-old CEO whose name often flashed across business magazines and local news broadcasts. But Ethan Cole didn't look like a man of power or wealth now. He looked cornered, literally pressed against the brick wall, his back arched in fear as the men muttered threats that cut through the rain. Their shadows stretched long and distorted against the wet pavement. Michael's pulse quickened. One arm clutched Sophie against his chest, while the other hand flexed at his side. His fatherly instincts screamed at him to turn around, to leave this mess behind, but another voice, louder, sharper, reminded him that the knife one of the men pulled was dangerously close to his daughter's innocent face. Wrong place, wrong time, he thought. But when the blade glinted just inches away from Sophie, the thought shifted into something else entirely. Wrong target, wrong night, gentlemen, Michael said, his tone cutting through the hiss of rain and the faint hum of traffic outside the alley. His voice was steady, though his heart thundered in his chest. The 3 men turned, amusement flickering in their eyes. To them, he was nothing more than an exhausted father burdened by a sleeping child. Easy prey. The fool. They laughed, jeering, mocking him for stepping forward when he should have retreated. But Michael Turner was not just a tired cafe owner. Years of struggling to survive as a widowed father, years of dealing with the hardships of raising Sophie alone, had sharpened something inside him, an instinct, a resilience. He moved before fear could paralyze him. With a swift, calculated motion, Michael pivoted his body to shield Sophie completely. His free hand shot out, knocking the knife from the first attacker's grasp with a force that echoed off the wet brick walls. The blade clattered to the ground, spinning across the puddles. He shoved the assailant into his partner, their bodies colliding with a sickening thud. The 3rd man lunged, landing a punch across Michael's jaw that rattled his teeth. Pain seared through him, but he didn't falter. His mind repeated a single mantra: Sophie must be safe. Sophie must be safe. Every move he made was fueled by that thought. He absorbed blows, countered with raw strength, used his shoulders, elbows, and the weight of desperation to keep the men away. The alley became a storm of motion, the rain mixing with sweat and blood. Finally, the distant wail of sirens broke through the chaos. The men exchanged glances, realizing the clock had run out. Without another word, they scattered into the night, vanishing into side streets before the red and blue lights could reach them. Michael stood in the rain, chest heaving, his arms still wrapped protectively around Sophie, who stirred slightly but did not wake. Ethan Cole leaned against the wall, trembling, his expensive suit drenched, his eyes wide with disbelief at the ordinary man who had intervened. For Michael, there was no glory in what had just happened. There was only the overwhelming relief that Sophie was alive, untouched, still breathing against his shoulder. He tightened his grip around her, kissed the top of her damp hair, and whispered to himself, "We're going home." The world might remember the night as the moment a CEO was saved from a dark alley ambush. But for Michael Turner, it would always be the night he refused to let fate take his daughter from him. The storm had passed, leaving behind only damp streets and the faint smell of rain-soaked asphalt. For Ethan Cole, the memory of that night clung like a second skin. Standing in the alley afterward, he had stared at Michael Turner, bloodied, bruised, clothes torn from the fight, and for a moment, words seemed utterly inadequate. "You risked your life for me," Ethan finally said, his voice laced with disbelief. "You don't even know me." Michael drew in a painful breath, his chest still heaving, his jaw aching from the blow he had taken. A crooked smile flickered across his face, faint but sincere. He shifted Sophie in his arms, kissed the top of her damp hair and answered, "I didn't do it for you. I did it because my daughter was watching. I want her to grow up knowing that we don't look away when someone needs help." The sentence landed heavier than Ethan could have anticipated. It wasn't the kind of line you'd hear in a boardroom, nor the kind of reasoning one expected from someone who had so little. Yet it carried more weight than the countless promises, pledges, or contracts Ethan had signed in his lifetime. He saw in Michael not just a tired single father but a man who had given everything he had, not for money, not for recognition, but because integrity demanded it. That night, their paths diverged. Ethan was escorted away by the police for questioning. Michael disappeared into the wet streets carrying Sophie home. Neither knew what would come next, though both understood something profound had shifted. Days later, the rhythm of life resumed, at least on the surface. Michael returned to his cafe, though its small windows revealed more empty chairs than occupied ones. The bell above the door jingled occasionally, but the register drawer closed far more often without coins or bills inside. Expenses mounted, and the future seemed uncertain. Michael sat at a back table during a lull in the day, flipping through his worn ledger. The numbers stared back at him, unforgiving. He wondered how long he could keep the place open. Rent was due soon, suppliers were pressing for payments, and Sophie's needs never stopped. The cafe had been his attempt at stability, but stability felt like a cruel joke. Then, on a gray afternoon, the low hum of an expensive engine broke the silence outside. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Michael instinctively stiffened, expecting perhaps more trouble, but when the door opened, it was Ethan Cole who stepped out. No attackers followed this time. No shadows, no knives. Only gratitude. The CEO's presence filled the room as he crossed the worn floorboards, his polished shoes contrasting with the scuffed tiles. He extended his hand, firm and deliberate. "You saved my life," Ethan said, locking eyes with Michael. "Allow me to repay you." Michael blinked, skeptical. He had seen men like Ethan before, men who threw money at problems, expecting it to fix everything. He almost braced himself for a check he would never feel comfortable cashing. But Ethan surprised him. Instead of writing a number on paper, Ethan spoke quietly, almost intimately. "I don't want to just give you something and walk away. I want to stand with you. Let me invest, not in profit but in this place, in what it could be. You turned your cafe into a sanctuary once when you shielded your daughter. Let's make it into a sanctuary for others too." Michael stared, disbelief flickering across his battered features. He wanted to argue, to insist that Ethan didn't owe him anything. Yet in Ethan's eyes he saw no trace of pity, only sincerity. A powerful man who, for the first time in a long while, seemed humbled. Weeks passed, and the cafe began to transform. Word spread, slowly at first, then with surprising speed. What had once been a nearly forgotten corner shop became a gathering point for the community. People came not only for coffee but for conversation, for warmth, for connection. Ethan's influence helped upgrade the equipment and the decor, but the soul of the place was still Michael's. On one evening, the laughter of Sophie echoed across the cafe, ringing like music against the brick walls. She darted between tables, her pink raincoat abandoned for a bright yellow sweater, her joy infectious. Strangers smiled at her as though she was their own child. For the first time in years, Michael allowed himself to hope. He stood behind the counter, watching Sophie, and thought, "This is more than survival. This is life returning." Money was still important. Bills needed to be paid, supplies bought, but something more profound was happening. The cafe was becoming a symbol of resilience, of second chances. It was proof that kindness, when acted upon, could ripple outward and reshape entire lives. Michael realized that the night in the rain had not merely been about defending his daughter. It had been about choosing courage in the face of fear, compassion in the face of cruelty. And Ethan Cole, a man accustomed to boardrooms and mergers, had been reminded that true strength wasn't in wealth or titles but in the willingness to act when it mattered most. In the quiet that followed the day's bustle, Michael often replayed those moments in his head. He hadn't seen himself as a hero. He had simply been a father protecting his child. But sometimes, the smallest acts of bravery become something much larger, sparks that ignite change far beyond what anyone intended. That rainy night, Michael believed he was only shielding Sophie from danger. Instead, he had given a powerful man a reason to remember humanity, had revived his own sense of hope, and had planted the seeds of a future where his cafe was no longer just a business but a beacon. And so, the lesson remained clear. True power was not about status or fortune. It was about the decision to stand up, even when the cost might be everything. That night had begun with the wrong target. But in the end, it delivered the right message. Humanity endures, not when we stand alone, but when we stand for one another. A rainy night, a wrong target, and a lesson none of them would ever forget. What's your take on true courage? Write it below, hit like, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next twist.